Thanks very much for that introduction. I actually have a number of slides because I'm a bit of a visual thinker, but you can also just listen to the words if you prefer. I'm an infectious diseases specialist. We often are called ID docs, and I like to call myself an ideologist for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I'm going to be talking mostly about looking at medicine through a lens stolen from ecology, which is a bit of a strange thing to do, but I think that you'll see that it's very useful as well. When we think about ecology, we think about how living organisms interact with their environment, and we think about ecosystems. So most people are aware of the concept of an ecosystem, but what we don't often think about is what happens in between ecosystems and what happens in those places where things meet and merge. And in those places, we have flora and fauna from both of the ecosystems on either side that are forced to either deal with each other or avoid each other. And those places actually turn out to be very, very exciting places ecologically. And I think it's a very useful metaphor as well. And so ecotones are a place of diversity and a place of risk and a place of a lot of dynamism. And the word ecotone itself is from eco, which is ecology, again, interaction with your environment, living things interacting with their environment. And tone is actually from the Greek word for tension, which is tonos. And tonos actually is a very important part of when you think about the ecotone, because ecosystems are in basically a state of trying to have dominance. And so the ecotone is also a place where there's tension in between those ecosystems as well. I think probably some people are guessing where this is going to go already. I'd like to thank right now Dr. Richard Gunderman. I can't remember what he was talking about or what year it was, but I do remember that he used the word ecotone in a medical context at a talk I was at within the last 10 years, and subsequently he's actually published some books on medical leadership where he references this concept. Now, let's say that we have an ecosystem indicated in the green shaded area, and let's say there's a species that really likes being in the center of its own ecosystem, and it's blue. And then those kind of pinky purple creatures are actually pretty comfortable going all the way out to the edge, even to where things are starting to change. So they're a more flexible species. And then we look at, let's say that's a forest, let's say that's the grassland. We have then a bunch of purple creatures that prefer the inside of their own ecosystem, and some bright aqua organisms that actually also are comfortable at the edges. And then finally, we can add some creatures that like to colonize transition zones. There are some organisms that like transition zones in particular. And there's also things that ecologists call mobile animals. And when you look at that layout, you can see why there's something called the edge effect, which is that in these transition zones, you might have the greatest diversity, the greatest turnover, the greatest threat, the greatest opportunity of anywhere in any of the ecosystems, because it's a very busy place. It's where the action is, in fact. So if you look at this in a more real-world context, we have some species that don't adapt, and they don't thrive at the edge. And I'm picking on white men with gray hair because they're an easy target. And then you can have adaptable species that actually can do very well in these places in between, that can interact with different organisms in a more flexible way and that are more comfortable with new ways of doing things, for example. Which brings me to medical evolution. Now, the idea of this centennial celebration was to talk about the last 100 years here. But if you look at medical history, the last 100 years has been busy for everything in medicine. And William Osler said, "The slow, painful character of the evolution of medicine, from the fearsome, superstitious, mental complexities of primitive man with his amulets, healing gods, and diseased demons," he sounds kind of negative about that, "to the ideal of a clear-eyed rationalism is traced." Now, I'm just going to point out that William Osler kind of thought we'd got to clear-eyed rationalism in around 1919. Now, there are some journals from the turn of the century where germ theory is still being debated as of that time. And Osler's textbook of medicine contained 90% elegant descriptions of disease pathophysiology and less than 10% on therapy. Just kind of word for, like, pound for pound, if you want to put it that way. And so I don't think we were really doing that well at the time. And I'm also going to point out that things that are old become new again, because you might recognize that as being a leech. Now, leeches were once derided as the most embarrassing chapter of medical history, basically. The dumb things that we used to do, including bleeding people for diseases. It didn't work in many conditions, actually. a few did. But leeches are now back. As a matter of fact, we use them to decrease venous congestion and grafts in plastic surgery. And I go to visit the leeches on plastic surgery fairly often because they're kind of cute. They're single use only, by the way, unfortunately. They have to be put away at the end of their tenure. If you want to look then at the last 100 years from the point of view of growth of medical knowledge, you can see that there's a pretty sharp uptick that really starts ramping up after the Second World War. A lot of things were happening in terms of pathophysiology of disease. As an ideologist, I like to point out antibiotics were starting around that time, and things were really exploding from the point of view of what we know about diseases and more particularly how to treat them. When we look at the doubling time of medical knowledge, if you actually look at the literature on this, it ranges from around 18 months to 3-4 years at this point, which is a fairly broad range, but nevertheless, it's pretty darn quick. And furthermore, I found this tidbit, which makes me feel very, very smart. Experienced doctors use about 2 million pieces of information to manage their patients. So that's a lot of information. And we probably access it in very strange and messy ways, honestly. But this 100 years has been pretty darn busy. And how did we get this knowledge? How did we actually have that knowledge explosion? Well, when you look at what was happening at the time, that all this knowledge was being gained, maybe as a reaction and partially as the cause perhaps, we developed subspecialties and specialties in medicine. So we started off with basically the big distinction was between medical doctors and surgeons. And the surgeons started as barbers, and they hacked off infected limbs and pulled teeth, and that was their job. Then things actually began to get a lot more complicated, and you started to have the equivalence of guilds, and you started having things arising like, internal medicine begat subspecialties, family medicine, pediatrics. Surgery started to devolve out into different kind of themes as well, with a great many surgical themes arising. And this both allowed increasing gain of knowledge and research and sharing of types of practice. And it probably also was a reaction to that, because once things get to a certain level of complexity, you're no longer certain that you can keep up with it all. In my own area, infectious diseases, I do HIV as part of my practice, and HIV medicine is very fast turning over. We get new guidelines every 6 to 12 months because the field has changed that quickly. And that's actually a pretty active place to have to keep up. And if you are doing many, many different things, you start to feel less sure in the areas that you're not actively practicing in. So part of the proliferation of specialties has been in response to how do we deal with this information. But is there any potential downsides of this? Using our ecotonic lens, and we look at this diagram, which I have to thank a colleague for creating with a really cool program. This is actually the American boards and their subspecialty boards. They have about 120 specialties. We have about 80 in Canada. But the principle remains, there's a lot of specialties. And if you look at each of those as being its own little ecosystem, are there any downsides to this type of structure? And you might look upon it almost as being siloization. And if you are an academic physician, which is really kind of the context that I'm speaking of, there's a lot of silos that you can belong to, and there can be some downsides to that. Not the least of which is, in every sphere that you're basically functioning in, the other people that are waiting for you to do things in your other spheres assume that you're off having coffee if you're not doing what they're waiting for. So if I'm on a committee and I'm co-chairing it and I'm supposed to revise some documents, but I'm on clinical service and I'm also having a number of other things going on at the same time from all the different areas I work in, it actually can get pretty hard for them to accept. But fact